Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here and to see so many familiar faces, some of whom I saw very recently in Oslo, many of whom I saw very recently in Oslo. I want to talk a little bit about the current environment for studying terrorism as academics, and also talk about a little bit about policy implications. And a lot of this content is based on a chapter that I've written for the ResolveNet project, which will be available probably within the next week, and we'll get into a lot more detail about a lot of these different elements. So I have 5 theses to nail to the church door today. And some of these I think will find some agreement in the room. Some of them may be a little more controversial. I think that these are statements that really have a great bearing on what we do next and how we approach our discipline. So the first one, I recently, for the ResolveNet chapter, did a search on Google Scholar, and there were something like 6,000 articles, publications that talk about the root causes of terrorism. And, in almost all of them, it's a mystery. I don't think it's a mystery. I think in almost all cases, with a few very rare exceptions, the cause of terrorism is extremism. So terrorism is a tactic. It is not a belief system. We have approached this, we all got into this field because of September 11th, because of a giant terrorist attack that was fueled by extremism. And as a result, we have approached terrorism as if it is the sum of our studies. And I think that this is really a mistake. There was an excellent presentation in Oslo on definitions of terrorism that really kind of got into this quandary that it creates. When terrorism is defined by motivation, are we talking about the ideology that's behind it? Terrorism is caused by extremism. Terrorism is a tactic used almost exclusively by extremists. And we can, there are a few outliers in this field. We can hypothetically come up with scenarios like in Battlestar Galactica where people use terrorism and they're not necessarily extremists. But it's very difficult to talk about terrorism as a social phenomenon. Terrorism is a kind of violence, and we'll talk about exactly what we mean by terrorism in a minute. So following on that, the second thesis is not all violent extremism is terrorism. So one problem that our focus on terrorism creates is that we are so exclusively focused on the tactic that we are missing out on a lot of things that happen as a result of extremism. So, for instance, hate crime. For instance, discriminatory policies, internment camps and concentration camps, of which we're seeing an unfortunate resurgence recently. None of that stuff is terrorism. It's all extremism. It's related to the ideas that cause terrorism, but it's not terrorism by itself. So that brings us to the third point. Not all extremism is violent. So we conceptually understand that a movement like the alt-right, which is primarily concerned with harassment, verbal harassment online in different kinds of spaces, has violent outbreaks, but the vast majority of what happens in that movement is strictly nonviolent. And in fact, almost any extremist movement, most adherents are not violent. So we've seen progress over the last couple of years in sort of the transition of focus from terrorism to violent extremism. So now we all talk about violent extremism and countering violent extremism instead of countering terrorism. But then again, we're still cutting out a huge body of obviously relevant activity that is not violent. So I think that all of these points really get to ways that we have framed this field that are not helpful for academic study, and they're not helpful for policy creation. So terrorism and extremism are overlapping fields, clearly, but they're distinct from each other, and we should treat them as such. And then finally, I'm going to talk, I'm sure many of you are tired of hearing me bang on about extremism definitions, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Our failure to define extremism in a clear and reasonably objective way is creating huge liabilities for us as an academic field and for those of us who are involved in policy. And I want to talk a little bit about the liabilities. So my past conversations you may have had with me have been about what a definition should be, and I'll touch on that. But really, I want to talk about the consequences of the failure of definition, because I think that this is, we often have a response to this, that this is kind of an ivory tower conversation about semantics and nomenclature, and in fact, it has pretty significant real-world impact. So, to distinguish between terrorism and extremism, there are a couple of key qualities. The first is terrorism is tactical, whereas extremism is strategic. So terrorism is aimed at achieving certain intermediary goals, whereas extremism is about the broad destination that you're going to. Terrorism is material, so it's a physical attack. It has a physical manifestation, whereas extremism is very abstract, which is part of the reason why it's hard for us to talk about it and define it. Terrorism is relatively well-defined, and I'm sure Christina will have some things to say about that. But when I say it's relatively well-defined, what I mean is, particularly in academic circles, there's a general consensus about what are the elements of terrorism, and I'll get more specific about that in a minute. Whereas extremism, there is no general consensus. There is a large body of work that's been done. There are many definitions that have been put forward in the literature. I just finished a chapter on that for my dissertation, and we'll talk a little bit about what's out there and why what's out there is not sufficient. So, and then finally, the question on terrorism, because this is a conference on terrorism and social media. The decision to interdict terrorist content, it took us a couple of years to get there, but it's not extremely controversial at this point. Footage of terrorist attacks, things that are directly inciting terrorism. There are still debates about this around the fringes, but generally speaking, everybody agrees that this is a problem that should be dealt with. When we talk about extremist content on social media, it gets much murkier because of the failure of definition and because of the nonviolent nature. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific ways that that happens. So the good news from my perspective is that we're seeing a shift from scholarly output that is exclusively focused on terrorism to output that is focused on extremism. So over the last couple of years, since the rise of countering violent extremism policies and the adoption of that language, what we've seen is that the number of papers mentioning extremism, which is the dark graph on the bottom, has steadily grown. Not explosively, but gradually in a way that I think is kind of healthy. After September 11th, we saw a massive explosion in content on terrorism. Terrorism still far outweighs content on extremism, but the balance is shifting. So the amount of material on terrorism is starting to decline. The amount of material on extremism is starting to grow. And this is partly a result of the policy focus that I mentioned before. It's also the result of the rise of movements like ISIS, which did a lot of stuff that wasn't terrorism, that we had to be able to talk about. They did a lot of governance. They did a lot of outreach and utopian state building that is certainly terroristic, and the implementation of it is nightmarish, but it's not terrorism by any kind of reasonable definition. So I think that we're going in the right direction, and I think that we need to do more. So, as I said, and also, reflecting the presentation I saw in Oslo, there is still a great deal of difficulty defining terrorism in a legal way, and sort of wrapping your head around the components of it and differences from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But the academic community, I think, has kind of come around these general principles for a definition of terrorism. It includes some component of public violence. It advances an ideological goal, or it has an ideological motive. It's designed, usually we argue it's designed to impact public opinion in some way. It's designed to shape opinions, whether to intimidate people or to inspire them. And it often involves, but not always involves, indirect targeting. So an attack on an army unit that's stationed in your country may not necessarily be terrorism, even if it has terroristic qualities. And there's a lot of debate around the margins of these things. But I think that, overall the field has kind of settled on some combination of these components as a definition of terrorism. And that definition is generally, for academic purposes, pretty practical, even though it's complicated in the policy arena. On extremism, we have a very different situation. So for my dissertation, I looked over about 30 different definitions of extremism that were in the literature. These were the papers that chose to define it, as opposed to just using the term without defining it, which is the vast majority of cases. Out of the ones that chose to define it, there were a handful of different definition types, the most common of which had to do with orienting a movement toward the mainstream of society. So, there are a lot of variations in the details, but basically the most common definition offered in the literature is that extremism is adopting a series of beliefs that are outside the mainstream. So enjoyed by beliefs that are shared by only a very small number of people and that run counter to mainstream values. So after that, there are a couple of different definitions that show up multiple times. Some are predicated on the use of violence, which, as I previously mentioned, I think that's not a good criteria, because we understand that extremism sometimes happens without violence. There's physical violence I'm talking about now, material physical assaults. We can talk about structural violence and psychic violence, and if you use that kind of definition, then extremism is usually violent. Some of the definitions were state-based. These are the worst definitions, which say that extremism is to hold beliefs that are counter to the authority of the state or counter to the state values, which is a definition that is in use in the UK right now, and I think it's a very bad one. And then finally, there are definitions off of social identity theory, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. What we want out of a definition is we want to be able to frame the subject of our study in a way that we can study it. So we need a definition that allows you to have study over time. You need to be able to look at these movements longitudinally. And we need a definition that allows us to do comparative studies. So within the last couple of years, everybody's kind of woken up to realize that jihadists are not the only extremists. And if we accept that premise, then that we need to be able to do comparative study, because you can get insights out of comparative study that you can't get in other ways. And so any definition that we use, for me, for those definitions to have rigor, they have to enable those two things: comparative study, longitudinal study. So if you base your study of extremism off of its distance from the mainstream, then there's a giant loophole there, and that loophole is called Nazis. So if you have any period of time in which you're studying the Nazis that you deem that they are not extremist, then I think your definition of extremist is not very useful. What you want to be able to do is understand movements that have similar kinds of beliefs, that have similar kinds of imperatives, and behave in the same way over time. And whether the movement is popular or not is not a good measure of that. Similarly, the relative definition and the state-based definitions are extremely accessible to abuse by authorities. So basically, you're an extremist if you're marginalized, and if you're marginalized, you're extremist. So if distance from the center of society is your criteria, then Mormons are extremists. Then anybody who's polling under 30% is an extremist. This is very problematic. In addition to lumping a lot of unlike movements together, it is hugely accessible to abuse. If the mainstream of society is able to deem anything that's outside that mainstream as extremist, then they are able to implement policies against them. And all of us are familiar with how these policies work and how this targeting works. So all of this relativity is deeply problematic. Similarly, if you're basing your definition on a relative measure, it becomes very difficult to do comparative study because you're comparing groups whose only similarity is that they are outside of the mainstream. And that includes a lot of groups that behave in a lot of different ways. Quakers do not behave the same way as ISIS. They're both outside the mainstream of society. One's clearly extremist, one is not. So I think that this failure of definition is really problematic. I mean, it's really hurting our ability to gain insights, to study these movements, to do it in an organized and thorough way. And I think that it is empowering the creation of policies that are deeply problematic. So, I took a jab at the prevent definition a few minutes ago. That is the least of our problems, really. It's a problem, but there are much worse problems. So we have a situation in China, we have a situation in Myanmar, where populations are being deemed extremist, partly because they're outside the mainstream or partly because they oppose the authority of the state, and terrible atrocities are being carried out. And a reasonable definition of extremism would deem the people carrying out the atrocities to be the extremists. So this is not just an ivory tower discussion. It is not just a nomenclature issue. This has real stakes for people. Lives are at risk because we cannot frame these issues in a way that we all agree on and try and apply them in an objective way. So the social identity approach to defining extremism for me is the one that makes the most sense. And so I've put two up here. One is mine, which I'm sure you've all heard me pimping before. And then the other one is a definition from Macaulay and Musco, which is really, I think, very useful. Now they're discussing, they did not use this as a definition of extremism, it's their discussion of radicalization. But I think that it works as a definition of extremism, which is extremism is an increasing demand for intergroup violence and preparation for and commitment to intergroup conflict. I think understanding extremism as being a demand for intergroup conflict, uncontextual demand for intergroup conflict is a useful way to look at this. And then the definition that I'm putting forward is slightly more specific in trying to really knock out as many gray areas as possible. We can't knock them all out. But I argue that extremism is the belief that an in-group's success or survival is inseparable from taking hostile action against an out-group. So you cannot conceive of the success of your group without putting another group down. The word inseparable here is trying to get us away from pedestrian conflicts, wars over territories or profits or legitimate disputes that can be resolved. The nature of extremist belief is that the conflict is eternal. And so I don't think this gets us out of all the problems, all the gray areas, but I think it reduces them to a manageable size is my hope. So there are a lot of consequences of this in our research, and one is category errors. So if we're studying terrorism what we really mean to be studying is extremism, we are excluding groups from the category that should be in there, and we are, in a few rare cases where terrorism takes place without extremism attached to it, we're including groups that shouldn't be. If we only look at groups that carry out terrorism, we are not capturing we're not capturing a fraction of extremist activity. We're not capturing the most important extremist activities, which are genocide, which are internment. These are hugely monumentally important activities that have a much higher death toll than terrorism ever will, and we're excluding them from the category. So we need, as I said before, we really need more comparative and longitudinal study, and I've been very happy over the last year or so at the conferences I've been to, and a lot of papers have been published. We've been seeing a lot more comparative study, particularly between right-wing movements and jihadist movements. I'm sure many of you saw Charlie Winter and Ashley Matthias did a really interesting piece looking at how the roles of women in ISIS versus the alt-right. We need a lot more of that. And we need it to be more aggressive. So we need to go out and get movements that are less obvious. So right now we got the low-hanging fruit. We can do jihadism, we can do the far right. And that's good field and it's important to look at. But what's really going to be interesting and where we're going to get insights is looking at far left groups versus far right groups, or looking at far left groups versus jihadist groups, or looking at historical movements like the Inquisition. The Inquisition, under the definition I put up here, is arguably an extremist activity, and that is something that we can maybe learn from if we do the work. Looking at these movements longitudinally also, if you have a definition that encompasses violent and nonviolent phases, that means you can look at a movement over a long space of time and try and understand why it moves in and out of violence. So I think that these are really important areas where having a better definition would be better. Then the third bullet point under academic is actually segues into the policy discussion. So one thing that happens when you have a vague definition of extremism is that everybody is chasing the headlines. So when something happens, there's a big attack, Christchurch happens, and suddenly there's a lot of money available for far right. When we get money from people to do our research, that shapes the kind of research we do, right? We look out, we go out and we see what grants we can get, and then we do the research that goes with those grants. If extremism is not well defined by policymakers or by social media companies who directly and indirectly support the work that we do, then we're going to focus on things that are headline driven and we're going to leave a lot of stuff out. And we need to understand for ourselves what's being left out. And if we don't define the problem clearly, then stuff's going to be left on the table, and it's just, and we're not even going to be thinking about or talking about the gaps in the research. Similarly, on the policy level, again, this proximity to power, if you have a relative definition of extremism, that makes that definition accessible to abuse. And we need to be able to push back on that when that happens. And we can't do that if we can't define what we're talking about, if we don't have criteria for why movement's in or out of extremism. So this also applies to content moderation questions, since this is a social media conference. I'm not going to delve hugely into this because I'm starting to run short on time, but there are different ways to approach content moderation. Do we moderate content that is simply violent? Do we moderate content that is promoting intergroup conflict or intergroup bias? For instance, anybody who follows the far right is probably familiar with, there are numerous websites, Twitter accounts, and Facebook pages that are black crime pages. And they don't contain a complete extremist system of meaning in them. They are just a list of things that are alleged to have been done by the group that's being targeted. They promote intergroup bias. They are clearly oriented for extremists, and the people who consume that material are extremists. But do we moderate that material? So all of these questions are made much more difficult when we can't define the terms that we're talking about. So we need to do better. We need to move toward consensus. So, after 19 years after 9/11, we're still debating what terrorism is. We have this soft consensus around the ideas that I mentioned, but we don't really have a hard consensus. And we don't have a legal consensus. So the first thing we need to do is start moving toward that soft consensus. We need to try and get on the same page. We need to get on the same page about the importance of doing this work, doing this definition work. And we need to define the boundaries of the field. We need to define what it is we're studying so we can study it better. We need to move beyond the Islamization of extremism studies. We've seen a big increase in coverage of the far right over the last couple of years, and that's really good. But ultimately, there is still a policy and smaller but existing academic community that thinks extremism only comes from one source, and we need to get past that. And it's critical that we get past that because we're leaving insights on the table when we don't. We need to be able to articulate our role in policy and political arenas. Once we have some sense of what the field is that we're talking about, what is our responsibility to push back when you see a government that is explicitly says that extremism only comes from Muslims, or you see a government that is engaging in anti-immigration extremism. What is our responsibility? How do we talk about that? Do we take money from people like the US government who are promoting policies that are arguably extremist? This is complicated, it's difficult. I've struggled with it personally. And I think we need to be aware of how the political environment is changing things for us. So, the US government example I just brought up is probably the easiest one to point to. Who wants to do CVE work for the Trump administration? Not me. We need to figure out how are we going to make a living if we're going to impose some standards on this. So if I'm not going to take money to do CVE work when I think the sponsor is trying to promote their own extremist or adjacent to extremism agenda, how am I going to get funded? If I think that a social media company is not serious about how they approach the problem, or their top leadership is, I don't know, just pick a hypothetical example, investigating George Soros to see if he's messing with them. How do we work in that environment? How do we square the circle? Is it, what kind of independence do we need? And how do we get the work done in what is potentially a reduced funding environment? So I think these are really the big questions going forward, challenges that are ahead of us, and I hope that we'll address some of those in the next couple of days. And I will, as I said, the ResolveNet article should be out within a week if you want to see a much more detailed discussion of this. And I will turn the mic over to Christina. Thank you.